today is text heavy. So I'm going to be very quick today with my opening remarks, just so that you guys, we're going to give you some extra time with this material today. Okay. Yeah, because it is tricky and it is specific. There is something that Chris says that I want you guys to really take in. There is a challenge to your instrument with text. And what he really means is the challenge is to find and mine the details of the story. To find and mine the details of the story and find a way through your imagination and through your intellect to unearth the character and the story, okay? In that challenge, it's not to think that you know, people always get caught with, well, can I ad-lib? Can I add this element to the story? But more than likely, most of the details you will find on the page. The page is not something to get in a contest with. It is something to be in partnership with. And we talk about this a lot in this technique, to be in partnership with the writer, to not be in an adversarial position where you're fighting the material. And a lot of the times, especially in auditions, we get caught in result, so therefore we fight the material. We have to do this well, therefore we make it an adversarial position between us and what's on the page, instead of having the page be inspiring. What you can find, what details you can unearth, how you can look at it, how you can approach it, allows something to come alive from what you're reading. And that's what you want. You don't want to be sitting there in, let's say, a way of analyzing. You want to be in a creative, imaginative partnership. So what do you think that means, guys, real quick? In a creative, imaginary partnership with what's on the page, instead of a literary deconstruction of what's on the page. What do you think the big difference is?
I don't know if I'm right, but I feel like, for me personally, sometimes I struggle with it, so I can understand, like, logistically, okay, this is where I'm going, this is where I got to be, but now sometimes it's about understanding the life that's underneath that. How do you get there? Right. What's that journey? What's that process to get there?
Well, the first understanding of that is really clarifying circumstance. Being as specific as you can with what the circumstance is. Circumstance is so critical to understanding conflict, to seeing the intimacy of the character's life, to be able to extrapolate details, and most importantly, to be able to make choices for why your character is undergoing or dealing with what they're dealing with in this scene. If we don't have a way in which to allow circumstance to first be seen and us to be creative about it in terms of how it lives inside the character, we're going to be in this space where the text is over here, and we, as he said, we won't understand how to bridge ourselves to the material. The more specific you can be with what's on the page, the more specific you can be with what the circumstance is, the easier it is to find the connection. When we give you time, I always tell people, you take as much time as possible looking over material. You really, especially for auditions, you should spend, even on 2 pages, you should be spending 2 to 3 hours looking at all the information that's on the page, as well as visualizing what the feeling of the words leads you to see. Visualizing what the feeling of the words leads you to see. Because the best example is last week, people missed very specific choices because they weren't mining the text for details. They weren't visualizing all elements of the moment-to-moment life of the story. And in that way, choices get very, very limited. And choices are your best friend. Choices for how you see the character, choices for what the character is undergoing, choices for what the conflict is, choices for how you can bridge yourself to it. Okay? Is that clear for everybody? So you really want to take all the time we give you to be in the words. Now again, you have to take the perspective of, if I read it with an intellectual deconstruction as a priority, I'm going to be in trouble. Why? If I sit there and start thinking of, oh yeah, exactly, because I'm going to put myself in my head. But if I look at it like a kid reads it, if I allow my creativity and imagination to work and keep my focus and discipline on what I can see from the feeling of the words, the feeling of the words, I'm going to expand my choices and I'm going to clarify the specificity of how the circumstance operates for my character. Okay? Circumstance is priority. You take as much time in allowing the visual elements that you can see from what you read to have an impact, to have detail, to have specificity. It's not to understand that there's a writer's intent, because I don't necessarily believe that the actor has to be invested in what the writer's intent was. But I do believe the actor gets to see from the feeling of the words who this person is, what they are up against, why they are here, what is actually happening, when in their life this is actually happening, where this is actually happening, to clarify how the story operates in that scene. Otherwise, you're going to get caught in a restrictive space with the material where you don't feel you have the options to make these types of choices. Where last week we were really trying to have you specify whether the prison guy, whether the person you were interviewing was lying to you. That choice comes from constantly being specific and allowing what you read to have a visual context. A visual context. Is that clear? Because if not, I tell you, when we go out there, me and Omar do this, we'll go out and walk around and see you guys fucking around. You know, you go, try to connect to the depth. I'm like, I would be on the page all day. Do you know, I'm staying literally until my name is called in this understanding of creative connection to the page. A creative connection to the material. And once I see that, when I come in and start talking to my director, I'm going to ask very specific questions. And those questions are going to lead to clarification. Those questions are going to allow me to bridge myself to the character in a very expedient way. Okay? And it's one of the things that kills directors, is that when you ask us, you ask questions that really don't have relevancy for this specific circumstance. Directors get crazy with that. They're like, well, what's on the page? Do you know what I mean? Because you want to remember, as an assistant storyteller, that's what you are in film. You are an assistant storyteller. You play a one small part in how the film looks and how your character is seen. Okay? So the more committed, the more specific you are with what the page gives you, what it can bring you, and the more you take the time and keep your focus and discipline on the actual page, the more things are going to start to expand instead of contract. And that's what you want. You want the page to expand how you see the life of the character that you're portraying, not contract it and put you in a result. Is that clear for everybody? Really, so take as much time as possible. Look it over. Ask yourself a bunch of questions. Really, why is this happening? What is actually happening? You can even, John Cazale, who was Fredo in The Godfather, said, if the actor simply asks tons and tons of questions, they won't worry about results. They will be in the life and in the humanity of the character. Because that's unfortunately what we do as human beings. We ask ourselves a bunch of questions, right? Constantly. We are constantly asking ourselves questions about who we are, what we're feeling, why we're feeling this, what's actually happening. In fact, we ask so many goddamn questions it drives us crazy, right, in our head. So literally, if you sit there and keep asking questions from what you see, the details will come alive for you, okay? I'm going to say that again. If you sit and ask a bunch of questions about what you connected to from the page, the details of the page will start to come alive for you, okay? So take the time today. Really, really, there's tricky little elements in here that we both think, I think, that are kind of obvious, that are really not, you know what I mean? And in terms of understanding how to get to what the character wants, understanding the relationships that are in this scene are very specific, okay? So take the time. Is that clear? Are there any questions about that? It's one of the wonderful things that I think she did in A Fantastic Woman. She took what was on the page and lifted it into this very profound space. Very, very profound. And the details of her behavior, her moment-to-moment life, came out of what she saw in that script. And it's a wonderful performance. It's one of the things that I love about Javier Bardem. He takes off the page and makes it into this other thing. He really does. He looks and searches for it, seeks it out, because the investment in circumstance leads to a creativity for the actor. The investment in circumstance leads to a creativity for the actor. So the more you're invested, the more focus you're bringing, the more detail you're finding from what you see, the more choices, the more options, and the more life you're going to bring to the page. Is that clear? You sure? Yeah. Okay, because this is a tricky scene, okay?
Every scene.
I don't know if that's true. Is that true?
You say it every time.
I do, don't I? I always say it.
There's something that you won't see, right? If you don't pay attention.
Well, I write it for it to be tricky.
But today's extra tricky.
Today's extra tricky. Actually, last week
was more tricky.
Last week was a little more difficult. But again, you guys, notice what we talked about profession. Profession is a real trick, right? Like, if I'm going to be a cop, how do I live in that space as the character? Well, I better know a cop in this specific circumstance, right? I better be that specific when I look at material to go, okay, so I get out of the idea of a cop and get into the life of what the cop is dealing with in this scene. Do you get that? Cops are very different in very different circumstances. So I better know the circumstance to allow my connection to the profession to live. Otherwise, I'm going to sit there and play ideas, okay? And this is the killer in TV. I've seen a lot of TV auditions where people were just acting the profession, not living it in connection to the circumstance that was on the page. And the more specific they were on the circumstance, the easier and more fluid their moment-to-moment life was, the more that we bought and understood how that profession lived in this specific conflict. And it's very, very important for television. In fact, television, one of the biggest things when you're doing a procedural or when you're auditioning for it, they better see the profession. They got to see you look like a cop. You look like a cop in this specific circumstance. You look like a lawyer who's defending this specific criminal in this specific circumstance. If we don't see those elements, huge parts of the story get missed by the audience. And if that's the case, really you won't get the job. And you'll sit there and go, well, I was in this real great intimacy, and I was crying, and was feeling everything. And I'm like, you're a doctor. You're in the emergency room, dude. I don't want you crying when you operate on me. So that level of logistic understanding gets caught when you're not aware of how the circumstance operates, okay? And of course, the last step of that is the circumstance will provide you an understanding of the physicality of the character. It really will, which is why in X or Actor, we talk a lot about sensory. We talk a lot about understanding how the physical representation of the character is in direct connection to the conflict, intimacy, and overall story, okay? So the more that you guys take the time to unearth these details when you look at the material, and the more creative you are in your approach, the more you're going to allow your connection to live and your choices to be expansive. Okay, is that clear?
Yeah.
You sure? Are there any questions on that? Okay, Omar, let's take them through.
Right.
Oh, is this your